Hi, everybody. Welcome to this month's Webinar Wednesday. Today, we're going to be covering California's new pay reporting requirements. The webinar is hosted by Jana Garman and Bill Osterndorf. Just a quick note about the webinar format. All participant phone lines are muted, but you can submit questions through the chat function. And if you have any technical difficulties, please email us at news@dciconsult.com. For any DCI clients on the call, a recording of this webinar will be available after in just a couple of days. A little bit about DCI. We are very data-driven and client-focused here, and our mission is to advance workforce equity and organizational effectiveness through our dynamic client partnerships. And we believe that every person deserves equal opportunity and fair treatment in the workplace and beyond. We do have a number of resources available for clients and non-clients alike. We do have monthly webinars such as this. We have a client resources portal, and we have our award-winning DCI blog. And finally, we do have a number of services including OFCCP compliance, diversity, equity and inclusion, pay equity, personnel selection, EEO litigation support, testing validation, and others. And finally, I will hand it over to Jana and Bill.
Thank you to Mitchell for the introduction. Let's get a quick rundown of what we're going to be talking about today in our webinar. So I'm going to go through the topics we have queued up for you. We'll be covering first some background on the California pay reporting, also going over the new requirements for this reporting. We will talk through the complexities with reporting on contingent workers specifically, and then also provide you recommendations on analyses that we think can be done in light of the new reporting requirements to ensure that you are prepared for handing that data over. From here, we'll jump in and I'll hand it over to Bill.
All right, Jana, that sounds great. So you may be aware that California has been requiring this pay data reporting for several years now. It started in 2021 and continued through 2022. And here's what's been going on. Organizations that have 100 or more employees and have at least one employee in California have been required to file this report on how their employees are paid. And let's be clear again for a minute. This is about organizations that have at least one employee in California, and then if they have 99 more employees somewhere else, you have to file. Those of you who have thousands of employees in California, this obviously applies to you, but it could apply to employers that have very small numbers of employees. So what's in the data that you have to provide? Well, in the last couple of years, here's what had to be provided. You had to provide information on race, ethnicity, and sex of employees. You had to provide data on hours worked. And then employees were grouped together into 12 pay bands, which are frequently used by states and by the federal government to analyze pay within the various EO1 categories that both the federal government and the state of California are using. A quick note here, you're not providing line item data on each employee, you're providing data in a summarized way within these pay bands and EO1 categories with this information that you see in front of you. So what's been changing? Well, on our next slide, we're going to find out that the state of California passed a bill called SB 1162. So for our next slide, what we're seeing is that in September of 2022, this law was signed into effect by the governor, and there's a number of changes that are associated with this law. There are some relatively minor changes, and some of those changes include the idea that the reporting that used to be due at the end of May is now due on the second Wednesday, due at the end of March is now due on the second Wednesday in May. For multi-site employers, you no longer have to do a consolidated report. Instead, you simply have to have a report for each of your establishments in California. And then there's a somewhat more important change. There was a real question previously about what kind of penalty the state of California could impose if there was a failure to either file this report or file it correctly. It used to be that the state of California could ask for penalties of some kind to recoup their administrative costs. Well, with SB 1162, that's now very different. Courts instead can impose a penalty of up to $100 per employee for failure to file the required report. So if you have one employee in California, that may not seem like a lot of money, but if you have 1,000 or 10,000 employees in California, this can get to be very significant fines very fast. What else is going with these new pay requirements? Well, let's take a look at the next slide where we see that there is some new data that's being requested as part of the submission that needs to happen. There is this very significant change in which employers are now being asked to include in their reports the median and mean hourly rate within each EEO1 category for those various combinations of race, ethnicity, and sex. Note that this is only by EEO1 category. It's not by those 12 pay bands. So you don't have quite as much data that you have to provide for median and mean reporting on those hourly rates. But you're going to have to figure out what you're doing to provide those hourly rates within those various EEO1 categories. And why is the state of California asking for this? Well, there's really only one reason that they would do that, and that's to determine where pay disparities might exist. The whole idea behind this pay data reporting is for the state of California to understand, are there certain groups of employees that are being underpaid? Are people being paid in approximately the same way if they're in the same types of jobs? Through this median mean reporting, this is a new way for the state of California to look at this data in a very simple way and try to find out, are there pay disparities where we need to step in, ask for more information, and now take a closer look at the pay that's occurring. There's something else, however, very critical that's happening that we'll find on the next slide. And that would be that the state of California is now asking for data not only on regular employees, but also on contingent workers. Starting in 2023, employers have to provide a separate report on persons hired through what the state of California has called labor contractors. And a labor contractor here is really some kind of organization that has supplied contingent workers to the employer. So we're not really looking at situations where some organization is providing you a regular employee to work in the job. Instead, what we're looking at is persons who are contingent workers who are working in a site through some kind of other organization and doing reporting then on those individuals. A quick note, this is only applicable to employers who hire at least 100 of these individuals. But it's also important to note that it's going to be difficult for employers to provide that reporting on these persons hired through labor contractors because the data that must be provided to the state of California has to parallel what is being provided for regular employees. And that includes not just the demographic data that the state of California is asking for, it also includes information on hours worked, on information for median and mean hourly rates, and it has to be done within those 12 pay bands by EEO1 category. So a lot of data that potentially is going to be provided on not only regular employees, but on contingent workers as well. So with all this data that California is asking for, Janet, what should employers be doing at this point to think about how they're going to provide this information?
Which is a great question. So on our next slide, we're going to take a pause here and think about all of that data. Especially with the newly required mean and median pay data to be submitted, employers really should be thinking about a variety of analyses on the data that is to be submitted. So we don't know yet for sure what analysis or measures California will use on this data, but we do have a pretty good idea of their options, just given the types of data that they're requiring. In prior years, DCI recommended having a privileged pay equity analysis in place ahead of submitting that data, and that was for the purpose of addressing any meaningful pay disparities that might exist and be uncovered with that analysis from the workforce. But that analysis is not necessarily specific to California employees. So we also were recommending conducting a test for trends in the pay band data that was being submitted to California. And our advice doesn't change dramatically with the updated requirements. You are still submitting the same data that you were submitting before. But in a moment, we'll touch on some additional analytics that we think that the state will now have the capability to conduct with this additional data they're requiring. And one element to consider in this planning comes from Bill's discussion of contingent workers. We'll return to this discussion momentarily, but it'll be important for you to determine what your population of contingent workers is, because you'll need to be thinking about what data you might have access to for this group of employees, and also how to analyze that data before it's submitted. So it'll be helpful to you to keep tabs on DCI updates. We'll be highlighting additional information that comes from the state, specifically on how they plan to utilize contingent worker data. So how pay data is collected for contingent workers is going to be a big issue moving forward, and we'd recommend keeping an eye on DCI communications, state communications, to help determine the best path forward. And we hope to help you determine that best path forward with potential analyses on the pay data that's being collected. So next, let's talk about what those analyses might look like. And the approach that DCI is recommending is a tiered approach, and that would be based primarily on the data being submitted to California, but also your overall workforce. So first, we've been recommending the last couple of years conducting a non-parametric test. One such test is called the Mann-Whitney test, and that type of test doesn't rely on distribution data, so full distribution data of every data point of every record. So there are limitations to that in the way that the W-2 box 5 earnings within pay band or by pay band within EEO1 category for how that can be analyzed. And that's exactly why the state is now requiring additional data. Doing a non-parametric test can uncover trends, and that would be looking, by demographic group within EEO1 category, but that's kind of the end of it. So we actually are introducing an additional analysis that we would recommend, which is to look for a wage gap analysis. So DCI is recommending considering having a wage gap analysis conducted, which is likely what the state of California will also conduct with this data. And they'll be looking to determine wage gaps between demographic groups, which is also information that you can glean. This would be within EEO1 categories. So because it's based on the mean and median data, not within pay band. And this type of analysis is going to yield for you and for the state more targeted and potentially nuanced results, and potentially meaningful. And what the state could do with those results is potentially compare your organization's numbers to companies within your industry. So this really could be an important glimpse into how the state is proceeding with what they gather, what knowledge they gather from conducting such an analysis as a wage gap. And then finally, the final tier is that we do recommend conducting a pay equity analysis that is in keeping with, let's say, Title VII principles. And that's in the spirit of ensuring that if there are pay disparities that can be identified, that they are and then addressed. And that analysis is intended to be meaningful and provide actionable results. And hopefully you would then engage in some remedying of potential pay disparities. So typically you're going to be conducting this analysis company-wide and under attorney-client privilege. So it's not going to mirror the analysis that you're going to see the state of California conducting, because it is potentially at a larger employee grouping. But it will give your organization the capability to defend pay decisions proactively. And so most organizations already have some combination of these three tiers of analyses, but we would recommend revisiting what you do have in place or what you have underway to determine whether all of your compensation analysis needs are met, specifically related to California pay data, since you'll be submitting that to the state. And then finally, we want to just come back to this contingent workers issue on the next slide. because it is very important, and we have a bit of a lack of clarity related to this group. We just wanted to have another moment to speak to this and just mention that SB 1162 is requiring submission of pay data for employees hired through labor contractors. As Bill mentioned, companies that have hired at least 100 individuals through labor contractors must engage in reporting. But for organizations that have a smaller population of contingent hires, the portion of the bill that we've been talking about does not apply to you as far as submitting data for these contingent workers. Now, the difficulty here for the organizations that are required to submit data for this population is that contingent workers are not employees on the company's payroll. So just as Bill mentioned, having access to their pay data may be problematic, and that might be practically just getting that information or potentially even legally. And that brings up the question of, what happens if a company does not properly report on contingent workers? And it's not entirely clear from the bill at this time, but there is a provision in the bill that penalties related to this group may actually then end up being allocated to the labor contractors themselves. Unfortunately, though, the state didn't provide clear guidance on this yet. And this group of contingent workers remains the largest unknown for all of us as we head into this new filing season this year. So DCI will be closely monitoring communications from the state. We encourage you to keep tabs on this, keep looking for guidance. Of course, we'll be alerting you when additional guidance comes from the state. And the fact that the bill did not lay all of this out very clearly lets us know that the state probably wasn't prepared to be able to answer these questions that we have. And we were hoping that we would have some guidance by now, but probably that means it's not very far off. Realistically, it could be March before we see it, which would give enough time for everybody to kind of get their ducks in a row ahead of the May filing date. But as soon as it comes out, we will be on it. We will be in touch. We will ensure that everybody knows exactly what it is that we're heading into for this filing season. So Bill, do you have any final thoughts as we wrap up here today?
Yeah, a couple of things, Jana. You've given a great summary of what's going on with both the contingent workers and the kind of testing that needs to be done. I think the bottom line here is for organizations to take away something really simple, which is the state of California really wants to know whether you're paying people appropriately. They want to understand where there are disparities involving your employees, and they also want to understand where there are disparities involving contingent workers. I think all of you know, and especially those of you who are based in California know, that there are lots of organizations that have many, many contingent workers on staff. And the state of California is concerned both about regular employees and about those persons who are not regular employees. So they're looking to find out, are there pay disparities? Are there different ways that those employees are being paid? And are there ways that the state can step in and stop employers from paying in what they think are inappropriate ways? The issue we all have together is we don't have very good guidance on some of these points yet. And so we will continue to watch, as you need to continue to watch, for when the California Department of Civil Rights comes out with more guidance, so we know exactly what kind of information needs to be provided on which persons and how we can look at that together to make sure that there are no disparities in the way that people are being paid. Jenna, I'll leave this to you to wrap up for the day.
Great. Thanks, Bill. Well, we want to thank everybody for joining us today. As you saw in the intro, you have an email address to send questions to. We really do welcome your questions. We may not be able to answer all of them now, but if we have them logged, then certainly when we're able to answer them, we will dive in. We look forward to touching base with you all on this. We really want to help you get through this filing season and feel confident. And thank you again for joining us.
Thank you to our speakers for that fantastic presentation. Before we end the session, we are launching a quick poll. Please let us know if you are interested in having a conversation with the DCI sales team. Additionally, we will be sending a follow-up email with more resources and a link to the ongoing webinar schedule. Thank you for joining, and we hope to see you again soon.